Calvin Reed spent nearly 3 decades convincing himself that his youngest daughter was living proof of his wife's betrayal. In public, he looked like the definition of success. A wealthy businessman in Scottsdale, Arizona, owner of multiple luxury car dealerships, sponsor of charity golf tournaments. A man who smiled beside politicians and shook hands like he owned every room he entered. People admired him because he knew how to sell an image. He dressed well, spoke confidently, and treated reputation like a second religion. To outsiders, the Reed family looked perfect. There was the handsome father with ambition and discipline, the elegant wife who stood quietly beside him, and the successful son who seemed destined to inherit everything his father built. But behind the polished family portrait hanging in Calvin's office was another reality, one built on suspicion, cruelty, and emotional punishment. Harper grew up trapped inside that reality from the moment she was old enough to understand the way her father looked at her. Unlike her older brother Brooks, Harper did not resemble the Reed family. Brooks had dark hair, warm brown eyes, and the sharp jawline Calvin proudly pointed out to relatives every Thanksgiving. Brooks looked like legacy. Harper, with her copper-red hair, pale skin, and gray-green eyes, looked different enough for Calvin to turn her appearance into an accusation. Every compliment directed at Harper somehow became another opportunity for him to humiliate her mother. Whenever relatives commented on her unusual features, Calvin would laugh coldly and say things like, "No Reed has ever looked like that," or "Maybe she inherited those genes from someone else." Sometimes guests laughed awkwardly because they thought he was joking, but Marisol never laughed. She would lower her eyes, tighten her grip around her glass, and apologize for things nobody should ever apologize for. Harper noticed those moments even as a child. She learned early that silence was the language women used to survive men like her father. Calvin's suspicion poisoned every corner of their home. If dinner was late, he blamed Marisol's dishonesty. If Harper brought home a good grade, he questioned whether intelligence came from whoever her real father was. When Harper was 8 years old, she overheard Calvin ask her mother across the breakfast table whether she had brought another man's child into his house. The words stayed in Harper's memory long after the plates were cleared away. At 12, Harper was accepted into a science enrichment camp at school, but Calvin refused to sign the permission form because, according to him, he was done investing in mysteries. At 16, Brooks received a brand new truck for his birthday, while Harper received nothing except the cruel suggestion that maybe her real father should buy one instead. Brooks looked uncomfortable during moments like that, but he never defended her. He had spent his whole life learning that love inside the Reed household depended on loyalty to Calvin. Brooks became the perfect son because perfection was rewarded. Harper became the family outsider because Calvin needed someone to blame for the insecurity he carried inside himself. Marisol suffered the most quietly. Before marrying Calvin, she had been vibrant and expressive, an art teacher who wore colorful scarves and laughed loudly without embarrassment. Over the years, that woman slowly disappeared. Around Calvin, she moved carefully, measured every word, and apologized before disagreements could even begin. Harper watched her mother shrink emotionally year after year, not because she was weak, but because she was exhausted from defending herself against accusations that never stopped. Every argument eventually returned to the same subject: Harper's appearance. Calvin treated his wife like a suspect, standing trial inside her own home, and Harper became the evidence constantly displayed against her. The psychological damage reached far beyond insults. Calvin refused to help Harper pay for college tuition when she was accepted into a forensic accounting program, even though he fully financed Brooks's education, apartment, gas card, and spending money. Harper worked late-night shifts at a hotel front desk while studying financial fraud during the few hours she had left to sleep. No matter how hard she worked, she felt trapped in an endless competition she could never win because the problem had never been her behavior. The problem was that Calvin had already decided who she was. Growing up under constant suspicion changed the way Harper saw herself. She became fiercely independent because she learned nobody would rescue her. She learned to hide pain because vulnerability only invited cruelty. Most painfully, she developed the exhausting habit of trying to prove her worth in every part of life. Good grades, hard work, politeness, achievement, none of it could fill the emotional emptiness created by a father who looked at her and saw betrayal instead of a daughter. Yet despite everything, Harper still loved her mother deeply because Marisol remained the one person who protected her whenever she could. Even while being emotionally destroyed herself, Marisol never allowed Harper to face Calvin's cruelty alone. That complicated love became the emotional core of Harper's life. More than wanting acceptance from Calvin, Harper wanted freedom for her mother. She wanted proof strong enough to finally silence the suspicion that had poisoned their family for 29 years. Calvin believed Harper's appearance justified every cruel thing he had ever said. He convinced himself that biology gave him permission to humiliate, reject, and emotionally abandon his daughter. What he never realized was that his obsession with blood would eventually destroy the very image of perfection he spent his entire life trying to protect. 3 weeks before Harper Reed's wedding, the illusion that her family could survive on silence finally shattered at the dinner table. The wedding was already planned down to the smallest detail. Her dress hung carefully inside a white garment bag in the guest room closet, protected like something fragile and sacred. Invitations had been mailed months earlier. Noah Bennett's parents had already booked their flights and hotel rooms. Excited to meet more of Harper's extended family before the ceremony. The florist had been paid, the seating chart finalized, and the church reserved for a perfect Saturday afternoon in early spring. From the outside, it looked like the beginning of a beautiful new chapter. But inside the Reed household, old wounds were still alive, waiting for one final opportunity to bleed. That evening, the dining room felt unusually tense even before Calvin spoke. The expensive chandelier above the table cast soft golden light across polished silverware and untouched wine glasses, but no one seemed comfortable. Marisol kept smoothing invisible wrinkles from her napkin, a nervous habit she had developed over years of surviving her husband's moods. Brooks scrolled through his phone between bites of steak, pretending not to notice the tension building around him. Harper sat across from her father, trying to focus on ordinary conversation, although she had already learned that peace inside that house could disappear without warning. Calvin barely touched his food. Instead, he watched Harper the way a prosecutor studies a defendant before delivering a verdict. Finally, without explanation, he reached into a leather folder beside his chair and slid several folded documents across the table until they stopped beside Harper's plate. The sound of paper against polished wood seemed unnaturally loud in the silence. Harper unfolded the pages slowly and immediately recognized the heading at the top, DNA Paternity Consent Form. For a moment, nobody moved. Even the air inside the room felt frozen. Then Calvin leaned back in his chair, tapped one finger against his wine glass, and spoke with terrifying calmness. "I think it's time we settled this before the wedding," he said. Marisol's breathing caught instantly. Brooks lowered his eyes toward the table. Harper stared at the papers without blinking, her pulse pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. Calvin continued speaking, as if he were discussing a business contract, instead of humiliating his family. "I will not stand in church pretending everything is normal while questions still exist," he said coldly. "A father is supposed to walk his daughter down the aisle. But before I do that, I want proof that you are actually my daughter." The cruelty of the statement hit the room like shattered glass. Marisol whispered his name in disbelief, but Calvin ignored her completely. Instead, he pointed openly toward Harper's face, toward the copper-red hair and pale skin he had spent 29 years treating like evidence of betrayal. "Look at her," he said bitterly. "She looks nothing like a Reed. She never has." Harper felt humiliation rise through her body so fast it almost became nausea. Part of her wanted to scream. Another part wanted to leave the house immediately and never return. But deeper than both emotions was exhaustion. She was tired of defending herself against accusations she did not create. Tired of watching her mother shrink under Calvin's suspicion. Tired of acting as though his cruelty was normal simply because it had lasted so long. What hurt most was not the DNA test itself. It was the timing. Calvin had chosen the moment when Harper should have felt happiest and safest to publicly remind her that in his eyes, she was still unwanted. "Bring me proof," he said, his voice sharp with finality, "or don't expect me to stand beside you at that wedding." The silence afterward was unbearable. Harper noticed her mother staring at the table as though she might break apart if she looked at anyone directly. Brooks remained motionless, trapped between loyalty and shame. Calvin looked almost satisfied, like a man convinced he had finally cornered the truth after decades of suspicion. He expected tears. He expected emotional collapse. He expected Harper to react like someone guilty. Instead, she slowly lifted her eyes to meet his. For the first time in years, there was no fear left in her expression. Only clarity. "Fine," she said quietly. "I'll take your test." The answer surprised everyone at the table, including Calvin himself. Harper stood up calmly, folded the consent form, and walked out of the dining room before anyone could stop her. Once outside, however, the composure she fought to maintain began to crack. Her hands trembled violently as she climbed into her car. She sat behind the steering wheel for nearly 10 minutes before driving home to Noah. When she arrived, he was sitting at the kitchen table reviewing fire safety blueprints for work. The moment he saw her face, he closed the laptop without asking questions. Harper told him everything: the forms, the insults, the ultimatum, the way her father had turned family dinner into another public trial. Noah listened silently, anger tightening across his jaw with every sentence. When she finally stopped talking, he reached for her hand and held it firmly. "You do not owe him proof to deserve love," he told her softly. Harper looked down at the folded DNA papers still clutched in her hand. "I know," she whispered. But this stopped being about his love a long time ago. And in that moment, something inside her changed forever. For 29 years, Harper had survived her father's accusations by enduring them. Now, for the first time in her life, she was ready to confront them. The DNA results arrived on a Thursday night just after 9 o'clock, and Harper knew her life was about to change before she even opened the email. For the entire evening, she had been pretending to focus on the television while secretly checking her phone every few minutes, waiting for the notification that felt less like information and more like a verdict. Noah sat across from her at the kitchen table reviewing fire safety reports for work, but every so often he glanced up, silently watching the tension slowly consume her. Since agreeing to the test, Harper had tried to prepare herself for the possibility that Calvin Reed was right. She hated herself for even considering it, but after 29 years of suspicion, insults, and humiliation, doubt had rooted itself so deeply inside her that part of her almost expected the test to confirm she was not his daughter. She had spent days imagining what that would feel like. Shame, anger, relief, maybe. At least then her father's cruelty would finally have an explanation, even if it was an unforgivable one. But nothing could have prepared her for what the report actually revealed. When her phone buzzed on the coffee table, Harper's entire body went cold. She stared at the screen without touching it for several seconds. The email subject line was painfully ordinary: "Your genetic relationship report is ready." Noah closed his laptop immediately. "Do you want me here?" he asked quietly. Harper nodded because she no longer trusted her own voice. Her fingers trembled violently as she opened the attachment. The loading circle spun for what felt like an eternity before the first result finally appeared on the screen. Harper Reed, 0% genetic match with Calvin Reed. Harper stopped breathing for a second. Even though she had prepared herself for that possibility, seeing it written in clinical black letters felt brutal in a way she had not anticipated. 29 years of accusations had just been transformed into scientific confirmation. Her father was not biologically related to her. The words blurred slightly as tears filled her eyes, but before she could fully process the shock, her thumb instinctively scrolled farther down the report. Then the room seemed to tilt beneath her. Harper Reed, 0% genetic match with Marisol Reed. She stared at the sentence, unable to understand what she was reading. Her mind rejected it instantly because it was impossible. Calvin's result hurt, but this destroyed reality itself. Marisol was her mother. Marisol had carried her for 9 months. Marisol had kissed, scraped knees, stayed awake through fevers, braided her hair before school, held her during thunderstorms, defended her against Calvin whenever she could, and loved her through every cruel accusation. There had to be a mistake. Harper read the line again and again until the words stopped looking like English. Her chest tightened so violently she could barely inhale. Noah was suddenly beside her, asking what was wrong, but Harper could not answer. Her fingers went numb around the phone. The sound in the room became distorted, distant, unreal. Then her knees simply gave out beneath her. She slid down against the kitchen cabinets onto the cold tile floor. Still staring at the screen like it might change if she looked long enough, Noah crouched beside her immediately, one hand gripping her shoulder as panic spread across his face. "Harper, what happened?" he asked again. She finally forced herself to speak, but the words came out broken and uneven. "I'm not hers." Noah frowned in confusion. Harper handed him the phone with shaking hands. She watched his expression shift from concern to disbelief as he read the report for himself. "That can't be right," he whispered. But the laboratory seal was there. The sample numbers matched. The test had already been verified twice as part of standard quality control. Harper grabbed the phone back and called the lab before Noah could stop her. Her breathing was shallow and frantic as she demanded to know whether contamination was possible, whether files could have been mixed up, whether someone had made a mistake entering the data. The technician on the other end of the line remained calm and professional, which somehow made everything worse. The samples were correct. The results were conclusive. There was no biological relationship between Harper and either listed parent. When the call ended, Harper lowered the phone slowly and pressed both hands over her mouth, as if she could physically stop herself from falling apart. "Then who am I?" she whispered. It was the first time in her life she truly understood what it meant to feel untethered from reality. Noah sat beside her on the kitchen floor without trying to offer meaningless explanations. There were none. He simply wrapped his arms around her while she cried against his chest in complete confusion. The test had not solved her family's pain. It had opened something far darker. The next morning, Harper drove to her mother's house before Calvin returned from work. The entire drive felt unreal, as though she were moving through someone else's nightmare. She sat parked outside the house for nearly 10 minutes before finally forcing herself to go inside. Marisol answered the door wearing a pale blue robe, her hair still damp from the shower. The moment she saw Harper's face, fear appeared instantly in her eyes. "What happened?" she asked softly. Harper could not bring herself to explain it out loud. Instead, she silently handed her the printed report. Marisol read the first page slowly. Her expression tightened when she reached Calvin's result, but she kept reading. Then she reached the second line. Harper watched her mother's face drain of all color. "No," Marisol whispered immediately, shaking her head before she even looked up. She read it again more quickly, this time as though speed alone might change the words. "No, no, this is wrong." Her voice cracked apart completely on the final word. Harper felt tears burning in her own eyes again, as Marisol clutched the papers with trembling hands. "I carried you," she said weakly. "I was in labor with you for 14 hours. I held you the second you were born." The pain in her voice was unbearable because this was not only a scientific contradiction, it was an attack on motherhood itself. Marisol looked at Harper as though someone had tried to erase nearly 3 decades of love with a single document. "You are my daughter," she whispered desperately. Harper crossed the room and took her mother's shaking hands into her own. "I know," she said immediately. "I know you are my mother." But even as she said the words, both women understood that something impossible had happened. The DNA report had transformed the story completely. For 29 years, Calvin's accusations had framed the family tragedy as infidelity and betrayal. Now the truth had become something stranger, darker, and far more terrifying. This was no longer a story about suspicion inside a marriage. It was a mystery about identity itself. And somewhere buried beneath decades of lies, there had to be an explanation for how a woman could give birth to a child who scientifically was not hers at all. After the DNA results shattered everything they thought they understood about their family, Harper and her mother entered a strange emotional state somewhere between grief and obsession. Neither of them could accept the possibility that the report existed without explanation. Marisol refused to believe that the child she had carried for 9 months was biologically unrelated to her, and Harper could not ignore the terrifying feeling that her entire identity had somehow been erased overnight. For the first few days they barely slept. Harper replayed every memory of her childhood, searching for clues that had never mattered before, while Marisol sat for hours, staring silently at old photo albums, as if photographs might somehow reveal the truth hidden inside them. But confusion slowly evolved into determination the moment Harper's grandmother, June Albright, mentioned something she had not thought about in years. They were sitting together in Marisol's dining room, surrounded by scattered paperwork and untouched coffee cups, when June suddenly looked up from the hospital records and said quietly, "There was a storm that night." The room went still immediately. June rarely spoke uncertainly, but now her expression looked troubled, almost frightened by the memory returning to her. She explained that the night Harper was born, Phoenix had been hit by one of the worst monsoon storms she could remember. Rain hammered the hospital windows hard enough to sound like rocks. Striking glass thunder shook the maternity wing, and at some point during the night, the hospital briefly lost power. Marisol's eyes widened instantly. I remember that, she whispered. Everything went dark for a few seconds. June nodded slowly. The nurses were running everywhere. They moved babies out of the nursery because backup systems weren't working correctly. Harper felt something cold move through her chest. For the first time since the DNA test, the impossible began to feel slightly less impossible. They immediately pulled out every document Marisol had saved from Harper's birth. Unlike Calvin, Marisol kept records of everything: hospital bracelets, discharge papers, vaccination forms, feeding schedules, even tiny handwritten notes nurses had given her after delivery. The dining room table slowly disappeared beneath stacks of aging paperwork. Harper approached the investigation the same way she approached financial fraud cases in her forensic accounting work, emotionally detached on the surface, methodical underneath. She began comparing timestamps, signatures, and inconsistencies the way an investigator studies transactions for hidden patterns. At first, nothing stood out clearly. Then she noticed the birth time listed on Harper's official birth certificate, 1218 a.m. Marisol frowned immediately. "That's wrong," she said. Harper looked up sharply. "What do you mean?" Marisol pressed both hands against her forehead as though physically forcing herself to remember. "You were born at 1231. I know because your father kept checking the clock during labor instead of looking at me. I screamed at him for it." June nodded almost instantly in agreement. "She's right. I remember the argument." Harper stared at the paperwork spread across the table. 13 minutes. It was not a huge discrepancy, but in forensic work, small inconsistencies often exposed much larger lies. She started examining the rest of the documents more carefully. The feeding chart attached to Harper's records listed a nurse signature that appeared slightly different from the same nurse's signature elsewhere in the file. One form documented a nursery transfer before another form recorded Harper's official birth. A handwritten feeding note referenced observations Marisol swore never happened. Alone. Each inconsistency could have been dismissed as ordinary hospital error. Together, they formed a pattern too strange to ignore. Harper began building a timeline across several sheets of paper marking every documented event from the night of her birth. She noted the storm, the temporary power outage, the nursery relocation, the conflicting timestamps, and the irregular paperwork. The more she organized the evidence, the more convinced she became that someone had either made a catastrophic mistake or deliberately hidden one. June then revealed another memory that made the tension in the room tighten instantly. "There was a nurse," she said slowly. "A young blonde nurse. I never forgot her face." Harper leaned forward immediately. June explained that several hours after the delivery, one nurse had entered Marisol's recovery room, carrying baby Harper with trembling hands. June remembered being disturbed by how frightened the woman looked. She was pale, June recalled quietly, like she had seen something terrible. Marisol's breathing became shallow as she listened. June continued, saying the nurse avoided eye contact, barely spoke, and held the baby so awkwardly that June briefly worried she might accidentally drop her. At the time, everyone assumed the nurse was simply overwhelmed by the storm and the chaos inside the maternity ward. But now, nearly 30 years later, the memory felt entirely different. Harper immediately asked whether June remembered the nurse's name. June closed her eyes for several seconds before whispering Helen. Helen Voss. The name hung heavily in the room. Harper wrote it down instantly beside the timeline she had constructed. Her instincts sharpened the way they always did when a case finally began revealing structure beneath confusion. This no longer felt like emotional speculation. It felt like evidence. That realization terrified her almost as much as it motivated her. Meanwhile, Calvin remained completely unaware of what was unfolding. He believed the DNA test had validated every accusation he had made for 29 years. While Harper, Marisol, and June quietly assembled clues pointing toward something much larger, Calvin celebrated himself as the victim who had finally been proven right. The irony made Harper physically sick. For decades, he had weaponized suspicion against his wife without evidence, never imagining that the real truth might exist somewhere beyond his imagination entirely. As midnight approached, Harper stood over the dining room table, staring at the timeline she had assembled. The documents no longer looked random. They looked connected. A power outage. A nursery transfer. conflicting birth records, strange signatures, a terrified nurse, a 13-minute discrepancy no one could explain, piece by piece. The story was changing shape. What began as a family drama about infidelity was evolving into something far darker, a hidden institutional secret buried inside hospital walls for nearly 3 decades. And for the first time since opening the DNA report, Harper stopped asking herself who had betrayed her family. Instead, she began asking a far more frightening question: what exactly happened in that hospital on the night she was born? Finding Helen Voss became an obsession for Harper after the inconsistencies surrounding her birth began forming a pattern too disturbing to ignore. The name haunted her thoughts day and night because deep down she already sensed that the elderly nurse carried the answer to a secret buried for nearly 3 decades. But Helen clearly did not want to be found. The first phone number Harper located through public records had been disconnected years earlier. The second belonged to a woman who introduced herself as Helen's daughter and immediately sounded defensive the moment Harper mentioned Desert Valley Medical Center. "My mother doesn't discuss those years," the woman said sharply before ending the conversation. That reaction alone made Harper even more certain she was getting closer to the truth. 2 days later, after hours of searching through old employment records and retirement listings, Harper finally found another number connected to a small apartment complex in Tempe. An older woman answered after several rings with a cautious, trembling hello. Harper introduced herself carefully, gave her birth date, and mentioned the hospital. The silence on the line became so long Harper thought the call had dropped. Then Helen whispered almost to herself, "Oh God," before abruptly hanging up. Harper stared at the phone in disbelief. It was not confusion she heard in the woman's voice. It was fear, real fear. Over the next 2 days, Harper called repeatedly but received no answer. She left message after message, first sounding desperate, then angry, then determined. She explained the DNA results. She explained the years of emotional damage caused by Calvin's accusations. She explained that her mother had spent nearly 30 years defending herself against a lie that now seemed connected to the hospital. Still, Helen remained silent. Finally, Harper stopped pleading emotionally and started speaking like the forensic accountant she had trained herself to become. In her final voicemail, her voice turned calm and precise. "Mrs. Voss," she said, "I have DNA evidence proving I am not biologically related to the people who raised me. I have hospital records with conflicting birth times, inconsistent signatures, and witness statements placing you in the maternity ward during the power outage. I am trying to understand what happened before attorneys become involved. But if you continue refusing to speak to me, legal investigators will eventually ask the same questions." 4 hours later, Harper received a text message containing only an address to a small cafe in Tempe and 2 short words, "Come alone." Noah refused to let her go entirely unprotected, so he drove her there the following afternoon and waited outside in the parking lot while she entered alone. The cafe was quiet and dimly lit, tucked between a pharmacy and an old dry cleaner in a nearly abandoned shopping center. The air smelled faintly of coffee and rain despite the Arizona heat outside. Harper immediately spotted Helen sitting alone in the back corner booth with both hands wrapped tightly around a cup of untouched tea. She looked far older than Harper expected, small, pale, and fragile, with deeply lined skin and nervous eyes that kept darting toward the entrance, as though she feared someone else might walk in behind Harper. The moment Harper sat down, Helen's eyes filled with tears. For several seconds, neither woman spoke. Then Helen looked directly at Harper's face and whispered shakily, "You have her eyes." Harper frowned immediately. "Whose eyes?" Helen pressed, trembling fingers against her mouth as if she regretted the words the instant they escaped. "Elena's," she whispered softly. The name meant nothing to Harper yet, but the grief in Helen's voice made her chest tighten. Slowly, Helen reached into a worn leather bag and removed an old folder stuffed with photocopies and yellowed papers. Her hands shook violently as she slid the documents across the table. "I kept these all these years," she said. "I told myself it was because I was afraid. But really, I think I knew someday someone would come asking." Harper opened the folder carefully. Inside were photocopied shift reports, partial incident logs, staffing schedules, and handwritten notes dated nearly 29 years earlier. At the top of one document was the exact date of Harper's birth. Helen stared down at the table before finally beginning to speak. That night, she explained, the maternity wing became overwhelmed after a severe monsoon storm caused a temporary power failure throughout parts of the hospital. Backup generators activated inconsistently. Emergency lighting flickered, and hospital staff rushed newborns from the nursery into temporary recovery areas, while technicians attempted to stabilize equipment. In the confusion, nurses were ordered to remove identification bands from several infants during emergency cleaning procedures because moisture and disinfectant had loosened adhesive labels. Helen's breathing became uneven as she continued. 2 baby girls were born 13 minutes apart, she whispered. 1 to Marisol Reed. 1 to Elena Torres. Harper felt cold all over. Helen explained that during the chaos following the power outage, a trainee nurse accidentally placed the identification bracelets back onto the wrong infants. The mistake was not discovered immediately because staffing was overwhelmed and records were already becoming disorganized. But several hours later, another nurse noticed inconsistencies in the charting system and alerted administration. Harper leaned forward across the table, barely breathing. "Then why didn't they fix it?" she demanded. Helen's eyes immediately filled with tears. "Because they were cowards," she whispered. According to Helen, hospital administrators panicked the moment they realized what had happened. Switching the babies back after the mothers had already held, fed, and bonded with them could create public scandal lawsuits, media attention, and potentially destroy the hospital's reputation. Executives held emergency meetings before sunrise and decided the situation could be buried quietly if everyone remained silent. Records were altered. Time logs were adjusted. Staff members involved were threatened with termination, loss of medical licenses, and legal action if they spoke publicly. "They told us the babies were healthy," Helen said through tears. "They said both mothers loved them already. They said correcting it would traumatize everyone even more." Her voice cracked painfully. "I wanted to believe them." Harper sat frozen in disbelief as 30 years of family pain suddenly rearranged itself into horrifying clarity. Calvin had spent decades accusing Marisol of infidelity, while the real betrayal had occurred inside a hospital administration office. Helen continued crying softly as she admitted she had lived with guilt every day since that night. She confessed that June Albright had contacted the hospital multiple times, questioning inconsistencies in the records, but administrators dismissed her as emotional and instructed staff not to respond. "I should have spoken then," Helen whispered. "But I was young. I had children. I was terrified of losing everything." Harper wanted to hate her completely. Part of her did. But sitting across from her was not a powerful villain hiding proudly behind lies. It was an elderly woman crushed beneath nearly 3 decades of shame. Finally, Helen pulled one final document from the folder and slid it carefully toward Harper. At the bottom of the page was a handwritten name, Maya Torres. "She's the baby who went home with Elena," Helen said quietly. "She's your mother's biological daughter." The words seemed to stop time itself. Harper stared at the name, while her heart pounded so hard it hurt. In one devastating conversation, her entire identity had been rewritten. Her father's cruelty, her mother's suffering, her isolation inside the Reed family. None of it had been caused by betrayal inside a marriage. It had all begun with a mistake hidden behind hospital walls and protected by people too afraid to tell the truth. Helen then reached into her purse one final time and handed Harper a signed, notarized statement confessing everything. "I'm old now," she said weakly. "I can't undo what I helped destroy. But I can stop lying before I die." Harper left the cafe carrying a folder that changed everything she believed about her life. Outside, Noah immediately knew from her face that the truth was worse than either of them imagined. And somewhere beyond the shock and heartbreak, another terrible realization was beginning to emerge. There was another woman out there living a life that was supposed to belong to Harper, just as Harper had unknowingly lived a life that belonged to someone else. After leaving the cafe with Helen Voss's confession trembling inside her hands, Harper sat in Noah's car for nearly 20 minutes, unable to speak. The name Maya Torres echoed endlessly in her mind like something unreal, something her brain refused to fully process. Somewhere, only a few hours away, lived another woman whose entire life had unknowingly intersected with hers from the moment they were born. A woman who shared Calvin Reed's blood, Marisol's DNA, Brooks's features, and perhaps even pieces of Harper's own personality. The thought felt both intimate and terrifying. Harper had spent her entire life feeling like an outsider inside the Reed family, and now she finally understood why. But understanding did not make the emptiness disappear. It only transformed the emptiness into grief for a life neither woman had been allowed to live. That night, Harper sat awake in bed with her laptop open long after Noah had fallen asleep beside her. She typed the name Maya Torres, Tucson, Arizona into a search bar with trembling fingers and immediately found several results. A LinkedIn profile appeared first: Maya Torres, pediatric speech therapist, Tucson Children's Rehabilitation Center. Harper clicked on the profile photo and felt the air leave her lungs. The resemblance was undeniable. Maya had dark brown hair like Calvin Brooks's sharp jawline and the same almond-shaped eyes Marisol saw every morning in the mirror. Harper stared at the photograph for so long her eyes began to blur. It felt like looking at an alternate version of the life her father had wanted all along. Maya looked like a Reed. Not just slightly. Completely. Harper enlarged the photo, slowly studying every feature with painful fascination. There was no bitterness in Maya's smile, no guarded sadness in her eyes. She looked warm, confident, emotionally safe in a way Harper never remembered feeling at that age. The realization hurt more than she expected. For years, Harper believed the problem had been her appearance, her inability to resemble the family around her. Now she understood the cruel irony the daughter Calvin spent decades searching for had existed all along, only 2 hours away, completely unaware of him. Harper continued researching, carefully piecing together fragments of Maya's life through public information and social media photographs. She discovered that Maya had been raised by Elena Torres, a bakery owner known locally for her warmth and generosity. Her father, Rafael Torres, had been a mechanic who passed away 2 years earlier after a heart condition. Every family photo Harper found showed affection so natural it almost felt foreign to her. There were pictures of camping trips, birthday parties, graduation celebrations, flower-covered kitchen selfies inside the bakery. Nothing about Maya's life resembled the emotionally suffocating atmosphere of the Reed household. Yet despite the love surrounding her, Harper noticed subtle details that unsettled her. In nearly every family photograph, Maya looked physically different from the rest of the Torres family. Her darker features contrasted with Elena's lighter complexion and her cousin's softer facial structure. Under one old birthday post, Harper noticed a joking comment from a family friend. Still convinced the hospital gave Elena the wrong baby. Hundreds of people had laughed at the comment. Harper nearly dropped her phone. The universe had buried the truth in plain sight for 29 years. For 3 days, Harper debated whether contacting Maya would destroy more lives than it repaired. Noah found her one evening sitting motionless at the kitchen table, staring at Maya's profile picture again. "You can't protect her from the truth by hiding it," he said gently. Harper looked exhausted. "But what if I ruin her life?" she whispered. Noah sat beside her quietly before answering. "The people who ruined your lives were the ones who hid the truth, not the person willing to tell it." Eventually, Harper wrote a message, deleted it, rewrote it, then deleted it again nearly 20 times. Every version sounded impossible. How could anyone explain something this catastrophic in a single message finally close to midnight? She forced herself to send the truth as simply and honestly as possible. She introduced herself, explained the DNA results, mentioned Desert Valley Medical Center, the storm Helen Voss, and the evidence surrounding the baby switch. She made it clear she wanted nothing from Maya: no money, no family claim, no replacement relationship. "You deserve to know before someone else tells you," Harper wrote at the end. Maya replied nearly 24 hours later with a single sentence: "Please tell me this is not some kind of scam." The sadness inside that response broke Harper's heart immediately, because it sounded exactly like someone trying desperately not to believe something impossible. They agreed to a video call the following evening. Harper spent the entire day sick with anxiety. When Maya finally appeared on the screen, both women stared at each other silently for several seconds. Seeing Maya move and speak made the resemblance even more undeniable. Harper could suddenly see Brooks in the way. Maya tilted her head while listening. She could see Marisol's nervous habit of twisting rings around fingers while anxious. Maya looked equally stunned. "Oh my God," she whispered softly at one point. "You actually look like my mother." The conversation began cautiously. Maya remained guarded at first, understandably suspicious of a stranger claiming something that could destroy her entire understanding of her family. But as Harper explained, the evidence step by step, The DNA reports the birth records. Helen's confession, the timeline skepticism slowly gave way to shock. Then Maya asked a question that changed the emotional tone of the entire conversation. "Did your family ever make you feel different?" Harper laughed bitterly before she could stop herself. "Every day of my life." Maya looked down for several seconds before admitting something similar. Growing up, relatives often joked that she looked nothing like the Torres side of the family. Unlike Harper, however, those jokes had never been cruel, because Rafael Torres never allowed them to become cruelty. Maya smiled sadly while describing the man who raised her. "My dad used to say blood was overrated," she said quietly. "He told me family was the people who showed up." Harper felt her chest tighten painfully. Calvin Reed had spent 29 years weaponizing biology against her, while Rafael Torres had apparently spent his life proving biology was irrelevant to love. The contrast between the two men felt devastating. One father rejected a child because he doubted blood connection. The other loved a child completely without ever realizing there was none. That realization shifted something fundamental inside Harper. For the first time, she truly understood that DNA alone could not define parenthood. Maya eventually admitted she had always felt emotionally disconnected in subtle ways she never fully understood. Not unloved, never unloved, but somehow separate from the people around her. "I used to feel guilty for it," she confessed softly. "Like something was wrong with me." Harper understood immediately because she had spent her own life carrying the exact same invisible loneliness. Two women raised in different homes shaped by opposite kinds of fathers somehow shared the same underlying feeling of displacement without knowing why. By the end of the 3-hour conversation, neither woman had fully processed the truth yet, but something fragile had begun forming between them, something deeper than curiosity and more complicated than family. It was grief, connection, and recognition woven together. Harper realized that Maya was not a replacement sister or a stolen identity. She was another victim of the same hidden mistake. And somewhere inside the bittersweet tragedy of their lives was a question neither of them could yet answer completely. If love shaped a family more powerfully than blood, then who truly belonged to whom after all these years? After Brooks discovered the DNA report proving Harper was not biologically related to Calvin, everything inside the Reed family began collapsing faster than Harper could control. But the most devastating part was not the medical mistake hidden inside the hospital records. It was the realization that Calvin Reed had spent nearly 3 decades destroying innocent people because he chose suspicion over love every single day. The moment Brooks saw the line confirming Harper was not Calvin's biological daughter, his face turned pale with shock, but he never scrolled far enough to see the second result, proving Harper was not Marisol's biological daughter, either. Like he had been trained to do his entire life, Brooks carried the information directly back to his father. Harper begged him not to say anything, yet trying desperately to gather all the facts before Calvin turned the situation into another public humiliation. But Brooks stood frozen between fear and loyalty. Calvin had built his authority inside the family so completely that even as an adult, Brooks still reacted like a child desperate to avoid disappointing him. By that evening, Calvin knew only the piece of truth he wanted to know. He believed the DNA test had finally validated every cruel accusation he had made against his wife for 29 years. Instead of responding with sadness or regret for the pain already inflicted on his family, he reacted with triumph. That night, Harper's phone exploded with notifications after Calvin sent a mass email to more than 50 relatives, business associates, and extended family members. The subject line read, "The truth about Harper." Harper opened the message with trembling hands, while Noah watched silently beside her. Calvin's words were cold, arrogant, and devastatingly public. He wrote that he had carried the burden of betrayal for nearly 3 decades, and claimed the DNA results finally exposed what he had always suspected about Marisol's supposed infidelity. Attached beneath the message was an old childhood photograph of Harper standing between Calvin and Brooks at a family Christmas party. Harper's red hair glowed brightly beneath the holiday lights, while Calvin added a final sentence underneath the image. "Look at her and tell me that is a Reed." Harper felt physically sick reading it. Calvin was not merely informing the family. He was humiliating them intentionally, weaponizing decades of private pain into public spectacle. Within minutes, relatives began responding. Some messages pretended to sound sympathetic while secretly feeding on gossip. Others barely hid their judgment. One cousin Harper had not spoken to in years wrote, "I guess your father was right all along." Another relative asked whether Marisol planned to finally admit the truth. Harper watched her mother sit silently on the couch, reading every message one after another. What frightened Harper most was that Marisol did not cry. For years, Calvin's accusations usually ended with tears, apologies, or exhausted emotional collapse. This time there was only numbness. Marisol folded her hands carefully in her lap after reading the email and stared at the floor with an expression so empty it looked almost dangerous. Harper realized then that her mother had reached a limit beyond pain itself. Calvin had not merely doubted her. He had systematically dismantled her dignity piece by piece for nearly 30 years. He had transformed ordinary family life into a courtroom where Marisol was permanently on trial. Every disagreement became another accusation. Every insecurity became proof of betrayal. Every physical difference Harper carried became an excuse for cruelty. The DNA report did not create Calvin's behavior. It simply exposed how desperately he wanted to believe the worst about the people who loved him. That realization changed everything for Harper. Until that moment, part of her still believed the greatest tragedy in their lives was the hospital switch itself. But slowly she began understanding a far darker truth. The switched babies were an accident. Calvin's cruelty was a choice. A storm, exhausted nurses, and hospital negligence created the original mistake, but Calvin alone decided to spend 29 years turning suspicion into emotional torture. He could have trusted his wife. He could have protected Harper regardless of biology. He could have chosen compassion while uncertainty remained unresolved. Instead, he chose humiliation again and again because suspicion gave him power. The hospitals stole the truth, but Calvin destroyed the family with what he did afterward. Brooks suffered silently as the family fractured around him. Harper could see the conflict tearing him apart even before he fully understood the entire truth. All his life, Brooks had been rewarded for loyalty to his father. Calvin praised him, mentored him, brought him into the family business, and treated him like the rightful heir to the Reed legacy. Now Brooks faced an impossible emotional collision between the man who raised him and the growing evidence that Calvin had become the source of the family's suffering. At one point, Brooks quietly admitted to Harper, "I always knew Dad was hard on you. I just didn't realize how much damage it was doing." Harper almost laughed at the understatement. Damage did not begin to describe it. Calvin's accusations shaped her entire identity. They taught her to doubt her worth, fear rejection, and constantly prove herself deserving of love. Worse, they trapped Marisol inside a marriage built on emotional punishment, disguised as moral righteousness. Even after the evidence began pointing toward the hospital switch, Calvin showed almost no concern for the emotional devastation he had caused. His priority remained proving himself correct. And that was the moment Harper finally stopped seeing him as the wounded victim of betrayal. He became something far more disturbing. A man so consumed by pride and suspicion that he sacrificed his own family rather than confront the possibility that he had been wrong. The rehearsal dinner was supposed to celebrate the beginning of Harper and Noah's future, but beneath the elegant atmosphere of the luxury Sedona resort, an emotional earthquake was waiting to erupt. The venue overlooked glowing red rock mountains painted gold by the setting sun, and the entire terrace had been decorated with white roses, candlelit centerpieces, and crystal glasses that reflected soft amber light across the room. Nearly 60 guests filled the private dining hall. Family members, close friends, business associates, and relatives who believed they were attending a joyful wedding weekend. Waiters moved quietly between tables carrying expensive wine and polished silver trays, while a jazz trio played softly near the balcony doors. From the outside, everything looked flawless, exactly the kind of sophisticated family celebration Calvin Reed loved to display publicly. He walked through the room that evening like a man completely certain he controlled the narrative. Dressed in a charcoal-tailored suit with a silver watch gleaming beneath the lights, Calvin shook hands, accepted sympathetic smiles, and performed the role of dignified family patriarch perfectly. Many guests already knew about the DNA test because of the email he had sent days earlier, humiliating Marisol and Harper in front of dozens of relatives. Some people pitied him. Others secretly enjoyed the scandal. Calvin mistook both reactions for validation. He believed the rehearsal dinner would become the final confirmation that he had been the betrayed husband all along. Meanwhile, Harper sat quietly beside Noah near the center of the room, calm in a way that almost frightened him. In reality, she felt like she was standing on the edge of a cliff waiting to jump. Hidden inside a leather folder beside her chair were the documents that would destroy the entire illusion Calvin had spent decades building: the DNA reports. Helen Voss's notarized confession, the hospital records, the timeline of the power outage, and the legal verification proving Maya Torres was the biological daughter of Calvin and Marisol Reed. In another private room near the back entrance, Maya waited nervously with Helen and Harper's grandmother, June. Harper had promised Maya she could leave at any moment if the situation became overwhelming, but Maya insisted on staying. "If this truth destroyed your life too," she told Harper earlier that evening, "then I don't want you standing there alone." Those words stayed with Harper as the dinner continued. Across the room, Marisol sat silently beside Brooks, her posture straighter than Harper had seen in years. Something inside her had changed after learning the truth. The fear Calvin controlled her with for decades no longer held the same power. Tonight she looked exhausted, wounded, but finally awake. Halfway through dinner, Calvin tapped a spoon lightly against his champagne glass and stood slowly to address the room. The conversations faded almost immediately. Harper felt Noah squeeze her hand beneath the table. Calvin smiled confidently, enjoying the attention the way he always had. "Family," he began warmly, lifting his glass, "is built on trust, honesty, and truth." Harper nearly laughed at the hypocrisy. Calvin continued, speaking about legacy, bloodlines, and the importance of integrity, carefully constructing himself once again as the victim of betrayal. Then, exactly as Harper expected, his eyes shifted toward her. "Some of you already know," he said dramatically, "that recent DNA testing confirmed painful truths our family has struggled with privately for many years." The room became uncomfortably quiet. Several guests avoided eye contact, while others leaned forward eagerly. Calvin sighed heavily, pretending to carry emotional pain with dignity. "As difficult as it has been," he continued, "I believe truth matters more than comfort." Then he looked directly at Harper. "Harper has had these results for some time now, and I think everyone deserves to know why she has been hiding them." Marisol closed her eyes briefly, as though bracing for impact. Brooks shifted uneasily in his seat. Calvin clearly believed he was about to control the room once again, just as he always had. But before he could continue, Harper stood up calmly. The movement alone changed the energy in the room instantly. Calvin paused, visibly irritated by the interruption. Harper walked toward him slowly, her heels clicking against the marble floor with terrifying steadiness. "You're right," she said quietly as she reached for the microphone in his hand. "Everyone does deserve the truth." For one brief second, Calvin hesitated. Then, believing the conversation still favored him, he handed her the microphone with a confident smile. Harper turned toward the audience. Her pulse pounded so violently she could hear it in her ears, but her voice remained controlled. "The first DNA report is real," she said. "I am not Calvin Reed's biological daughter." Immediate whispers spread through the room. Several guests glanced toward Calvin sympathetically. Harper saw the beginning of satisfaction appear in his expression. Then she continued, "But there's another part of the report my father never bothered to learn." The room quieted instantly again. Harper lifted a remote control from the table beside her and pressed a button. Behind her, the large presentation screen mounted near the ballroom wall illuminated with the full DNA results. Harper's voice became sharper now, stronger. "The same report shows that I am also not biologically related to Marisol Reed." Complete silence. Genuine silence. Not even silverware moved anymore. Calvin's confident expression vanished immediately, replaced by visible confusion. Brooks stared at the screen in disbelief. Marisol lowered her head as tears filled her eyes. Harper continued before anyone could interrupt. "My mother did not betray anyone," she said firmly. "A hospital did." Another click of the remote revealed hospital records, birth time stamps, and scanned copies of Helen Voss's signed confession. Harper explained the storm, the power outage, the temporary nursery relocation, the switched identification bracelets, and the cover-up orchestrated by Desert Valley Medical Center nearly 29 years earlier. Every sentence stripped away another layer of Calvin's carefully protected image. Guests who once pitied him now stared with growing horror as they realized what his accusations had done to his family. Then Harper looked toward the back entrance of the room. "There's someone else you all need to meet," she said quietly. The doors opened slowly. Maya Torres stepped inside beside Helen Voss. The effect on the room was immediate and explosive. Gasps spread across the ballroom almost instantly because the resemblance was undeniable. Maya carried Calvin's jawline, Brooks's eyes, and Marisol's features so clearly that the truth became visible before anyone even spoke. Brooks rose halfway from his chair in complete shock. Marisol pressed trembling fingers against her mouth. Calvin looked at Maya as though reality itself had broken apart in front of him. Harper's voice softened slightly as she introduced her. "This is Maya Torres. She was born 13 minutes before me during the storm at Desert Valley Medical Center. DNA testing confirms she is the biological daughter of Calvin and Marisol Reed." The room erupted into whispers so loud they almost sounded like waves crashing. Calvin stared helplessly between Maya, the screen, and Marisol as every ounce of certainty drained from his face. Then Helen stepped forward slowly, visibly trembling. Despite her age and fear, her voice carried through the room with painful clarity. "I was the nurse on duty that night," she confessed. "The babies were accidentally switched after the power outage. The hospital discovered the mistake before sunrise and ordered us to remain silent." Several guests looked physically sick hearing the confession aloud. Brooks sat down heavily as though his legs no longer worked. Calvin whispered, "No, no," repeatedly under his breath. Unable to process what he was hearing, Harper looked directly at him, years of pain hardening inside her voice. "The switch was an accident," she said. "But what you did afterward was not." Calvin's body visibly collapsed beneath the weight of those words. The powerful businessman who once controlled every room he entered suddenly looked small, fragile, almost unrecognizable. His knees gave out completely and he dropped into a chair before sliding forward, both hands covering his face as broken sobs escaped him publicly for the first time in his life. But no one rushed to comfort him. Not Brooks. Not Harper. Not even Marisol. The silence surrounding him felt colder than anger. Then came the moment that truly shattered him. Calvin slowly reached one trembling hand toward Maya as tears streamed down his face. Her eyes filled with tears, but her voice remained steady. "I may be your daughter by blood," she said quietly, "but I don't know if you deserve to be my father." The sentence hit Calvin harder than any public humiliation ever could, because in that single moment the entire foundation of his identity collapsed. For 29 years he had worshipped bloodline, legacy, and biological connection while destroying the people who actually loved him. And now the daughter he spent decades unknowingly searching for stood in front of him, rejecting everything he believed made him a father. Around the ballroom, guests no longer saw Calvin Reed as the betrayed husband preserving family honor. They saw a man whose obsession with suspicion and control had poisoned his family long before the truth ever surfaced. The perfect image he spent decades building did not simply crack that night, it shattered completely in front of everyone. For the first time in his life, Calvin Reed completely lost control in front of other people. The confident businessman who had spent decades commanding rooms with his voice, his money, and his reputation now sat shattered beneath the weight of a truth he could no longer manipulate. After Helen Voss confessed publicly that the babies had been switched at the hospital, and Maya Torres was revealed as the biological daughter of Calvin and Marisol, the elegant rehearsal dinner fell into stunned silence. No one moved. No one rushed to defend him. Calvin looked around the ballroom as though searching desperately for someone to restore the version of reality he had lived inside for nearly 30 years. But there was nowhere left to hide. Every accusation he had thrown at Marisol, every cruel comment directed at Harper, every public humiliation disguised as truth, all of it suddenly stood exposed as something far uglier than suspicion. It was abuse built on pride. Calvin's breathing became uneven as he stared at the DNA reports glowing across the presentation screen. His face had gone completely pale, stripped of the arrogance that usually defined him. "No," he whispered, weakly shaking his head over and over again. "No, this can't." But it was real. The evidence was undeniable. The daughter he rejected for 29 years had never been evidence of betrayal. She had been an innocent child trapped inside a mistake created by strangers, and the wife he publicly accused, shamed, and emotionally punished for decades had told the truth the entire time. Calvin suddenly bent forward as if something inside his chest had collapsed. One hand gripped the edge of the table while the other covered his face, but it did nothing to hide the sound that escaped him. He was crying. Not controlled tears, not polished sadness for public sympathy. Real. Broken sobs tore through him in front of everyone who once admired him. Then his knees gave out completely. The powerful man who built his entire identity around dominance and certainty sank helplessly onto the floor beside the table. Guests stared in silence while Calvin cried into his hands like a man finally crushed beneath the consequences of his own choices. But the most painful part was not that he fell. It was that nobody moved to catch him. Brooks remained frozen in his chair. Staring at his father with hollow disbelief, Harper stood beside Noah without expression. Marisol simply watched quietly, her face calm in a way that felt almost frightening. For decades, Calvin had expected his family to absorb the emotional damage he created. Now, for the first time, he was completely alone inside it. Then Maya spoke. She had been crying silently near the back of the room ever since Helen's confession. Overwhelmed by the impossible truth that the people standing before her were biologically her family, Calvin slowly lifted one trembling hand toward her, desperate, almost childlike. "Maya," he whispered painfully. It was the first time he had ever spoken her name aloud. For a brief second, the entire room seemed to hold its breath. But Maya stepped backward instead of forward. Tears ran down her face, yet her voice remained steady when she answered him. "You may be my biological father," she said quietly, "but I don't know if you deserve to be my father." The sentence struck harder than any public accusation ever could. Calvin looked physically wounded by the words because they destroyed the one belief he had built his life around, that blood alone created family. For nearly 30 years he had worshipped biology while ignoring love, loyalty, kindness, and trust. And now the daughter who actually carried his blood wanted nothing from him emotionally. Meanwhile, the daughter he rejected had shown more strength and integrity than he ever had. Brooks lowered his head after hearing Maya speak. Harper could see something breaking inside him too. All his life, Brooks had idolized Calvin. He followed his father into business, copied his mannerisms, defended his behavior, and believed Calvin represented strength. But now he was forced to confront a terrifying reality. The man he admired had spent decades emotionally destroying innocent people because he valued pride more than compassion. Brooks looked at his father differently now, not with loyalty but with disappointment. That hurt Calvin almost as much as Maya's rejection. Then Marisol finally stepped forward. For years she had answered Calvin's cruelty with silence, apologies, or quiet endurance. But the woman standing before him now looked different, stronger, free. She stared down at the man who had spent decades accusing her of betrayal and spoke with calm clarity. "You owe me an apology," she said firmly. "Not privately, publicly. In front of every person you convinced to doubt me." Calvin tried to answer, but his voice collapsed into broken sounds. Marisol continued anyway. "Then you owe Harper an apology for every year you made her feel unwanted." Tears streamed down Calvin's face as he realized the full scale of what he had destroyed. The tragedy was no longer the hospital mistake itself. The real tragedy was that he had been given nearly 30 years to choose love over suspicion and failed every single time. The months following the rehearsal dinner felt less like a clean ending and more like the slow reconstruction of lives that had been shattered for nearly 3 decades. Once the truth became public, Desert Valley Medical Center could no longer hide behind silence and altered paperwork. Attorneys representing both the Reed family and the Torres family filed lawsuits against the hospital using Helen Voss's testimony, the DNA reports, and the preserved hospital records as evidence of institutional negligence and deliberate concealment. News of the baby switch spread quickly through local media, and public outrage grew even stronger after details emerged showing that hospital administrators had discovered the mistake within hours of the births, but intentionally chose secrecy to avoid scandal and financial liability. Under mounting legal and public pressure, the hospital eventually agreed to a massive settlement with both families. But more important than the money was the public admission of responsibility. Desert Valley issued a formal apology, acknowledging the switch, the cover-up, and the irreversible emotional damage caused by their decisions. The hospital also implemented major changes to newborn identification procedures, introducing stricter electronic tracking systems and multiple verification protocols designed to ensure no other family would experience the same nightmare again. Helen Voss testified during the proceedings despite her age and fragile health, finally freeing herself from the guilt she had carried for 29 years. Harper did not forgive her completely, but she understood that the real cruelty had come from the institution that valued reputation over human lives. Meanwhile, the emotional consequences inside the Reed family proved far more complicated than any courtroom settlement. Calvin Reed's public collapse destroyed the image he had spent decades building. Several charity boards quietly asked him to resign. Business relationships became strained after the scandal spread through social circles and local news reports. Friends who once admired his confidence now saw the damage hidden beneath it. But the greatest punishment was not financial or social. It was personal. Calvin finally understood that suspicion had cost him the very family he claimed he was trying to protect. Marisol moved out permanently and began living with June for a period while rebuilding her life away from Calvin's control. For the first time in years, she laughed without hesitation, spoke without fear, and stopped apologizing for things that were never her fault. The woman who once survived by staying silent slowly rediscovered herself. Harper noticed the difference in small moments first: the way her mother stood straighter, the way she smiled more naturally, the way peace gradually replaced exhaustion in her eyes. Marisol had spent decades defending her dignity against accusations she did not deserve, and finally the truth returned that dignity to her publicly. The most emotional moment came on Harper's wedding day. Originally, Calvin had imagined himself proudly walking his daughter down the aisle as proof of family legacy and respectability. Instead, he sat quietly in the second row, while Marisol took Harper's arm and guided her toward the altar herself. As they walked together through the church, Harper realized no DNA test in the world could erase what Marisol truly was to her. Biology had been stolen by a hospital, but motherhood had been built through sacrifice, protection, loyalty, and unconditional love. Marisol was the woman who stayed awake through fevers, defended Harper against cruelty, and loved her even while her own life was collapsing. Nothing could replace that. Harper and Maya also began building something fragile but meaningful together, not as replacements for the lives they lost, but as two women connected by the same tragedy. Their relationship developed slowly, sometimes awkwardly, sometimes beautifully, because neither of them wanted to erase the families that had raised them. Maya still loved Elena deeply. Harper still loved Marisol. But over time they created space for each other too. Shared dinners became regular phone calls, then holidays, then genuine sisterhood formed, not through obligation but choice. In many ways, Maya and Harper understood each other better than anyone else ever could, because both had spent their entire lives sensing they were somehow misplaced without knowing why. Calvin tried repeatedly to repair the damage, paying for therapy, contributing to legal costs, helping Harper with remaining student debt, and offering apologies that came too late to fully heal what he broke. Some wounds could not be repaired simply because the truth finally arrived. Brooks struggled deeply with losing the image of the father he once admired, while Harper learned that forgiveness did not necessarily mean forgetting. The hardest lesson for Calvin was understanding that biology alone could not force emotional connection back into existence once trust had been destroyed. In the end, the greatest truth revealed by the DNA tests had nothing to do with blood at all. Harper finally understood that family is not defined only by genetics. DNA can identify biological origins, but it cannot measure loyalty, compassion, sacrifice, or love. Those things are choices people make every day. The hospital's mistake created tragedy, but Calvin's suspicion transformed that tragedy into decades of emotional destruction. His refusal to trust the people who loved him nearly ruined every life connected to his own. Harper carried that lesson with her long after the lawsuits ended and the headlines disappeared. Some people spend their lives searching for proof that they belong somewhere, but real belonging is not created by shared blood. It is created by the people who choose to stand beside you when truth becomes painful, when life becomes unfair, and when love requires faith instead of certainty.